The collar was silver. Not real silver that would have killed her, but it was silver-plated, stamped with the sigil of the Asheville Pack, and it locked around her throat with a sound like a judge's gavel. Cold, final, humiliating. Lyra Voss stood in the center of the main hall of the Asheville estate and did not flinch. She had practiced not flinching for 23 years. She was very good at it. "Omega," said the pack administrator, reading from a clipboard without looking at her. His name was Fenwick. He smelled of old paper and contempt. Designation, housebound servant. Assignment, the Alpha's Eastern Wing. Duties to begin at dawn. Around her, wolves in pressed clothes moved through the hall like currents in a cold river. None of them looked at her. Omegas were furniture. Omegas were inconveniences to be arranged and forgotten. Lyra kept her breathing even. She counted the exits: 3 doors, 2 windows, 1 servant's passage behind the tapestry of the hunt scene. She noted the security: 1 guard at the main entrance, old, bored, relying on pack hierarchy to do the work intimidation used to. She catalogued the faces: 12 wolves in view, 4 of them dominant enough to cause trouble if she moved wrong. She did none of this visibly. Her eyes stayed soft and downcast, her shoulders curved inward, her scent, carefully, painstakingly suppressed, broadcasting nothing but submission and fatigue. "You'll address the Alpha as my lord," Fenwick continued, turning a page. "You will not speak unless spoken to. You will not enter his private study, his training hall, or the North Tower. Violation of these terms will result in punishment," Lyra said very quietly. "Yes, I understand." Fenwick finally looked at her. His eyes were flat and gray and slightly surprised, the way people always looked when furniture spoke. "Good," he said, and clicked his pen. She was given a room the size of a generous closet on the servants' floor at the back of the East Wing. The window overlooked the kitchen gardens. The mattress was thin but clean. There was a hook on the door for the collar, which she was allowed to remove at night, a mercy, or perhaps just practicality. Lyra sat on the edge of the mattress, and for the first time in 6 hours, let her spine straighten. She rolled her shoulders back, lifted her chin, felt the particular relief of dropping a performance the way you drop a heavy pack after a long march. Then she pressed her hand flat against the inside of her left wrist, over the tattoo she'd had inked in a basement parlor in the city 3 years ago. A small, 8-pointed star, the old cartographer's symbol for here be the unknown. She was not an Omega. She was not even close. Her name, her real name, the one on the documents locked in a safety deposit box in a bank in the city, was Lyra Voss Thane. The Thane part was the problem. The Thane part was why she was here, in the Asheville estate, wearing a collar that was never meant for her throat. The Thane bloodline was old, older than Asheville, older than most of the ruling packs in the Northern Territories. It was also, officially, extinct, the last of the Thanes having died in the Territory Wars 17 years ago, when Lyra was 6 years old and her mother had wrapped her in a winter coat, pressed a forged identity chip into her hand, and told her to run and not look back. She had run. She had not looked back. But she had come back deliberately, carefully, after years of preparation, because something was being hidden in the Asheville estate, and that something had belonged to her family, and she intended to take it. The plan was simple in the way that very complicated things sometimes appeared simple when you'd spent 3 years constructing them. Infiltrate as an Omega, move invisibly through the estate, find the vault beneath the North Tower, retrieve what was taken, leave. The only complication, the variable she hadn't fully accounted for, was the Alpha himself. Selim Asheville. She'd studied him, of course. Read every record she could find, cross-reference the pack's external-facing documents with intelligence gathered from former staff, from rival packs, from a journalist contact in the capital who owed her a favor. She knew his history, his public record, his reputation. What she hadn't accounted for was the reality of him. She found that out the next morning. Chapter 2: First Contact. Lyra was on her knees in the east hallway, scrubbing the baseboards, not because they needed scrubbing, but because it gave her an excuse to be in the corridor at 6 in the morning, when the Alpha ran his daily circuit of the estate grounds, when she heard him coming. She heard him the way you hear weather, not sound exactly, but a change in pressure. The hallway's ambient noise shifted. A door opened somewhere and the quality of the air changed. She kept her head down and her scrubbing steady. His footsteps were quiet for someone his size. She knew from the intelligence files that he was large. All alphas ran large, the dominance genes expressing in mass and presence as much as anything else. But files couldn't capture the particular weight of a person's tread, the way the floorboards registered his passing. He stopped. She felt it before she registered it consciously, the cessation of movement at her peripheral, a pause in the morning's rhythm. "You're new," he said. His voice was low. Not aggressive, just certain, the way dominant wolves spoke, like they were accustomed to sentences being sufficient. "Yes, my lord," Lyra said without looking up. Her voice was soft, slightly rough with performed nervousness. She let her scrubbing hand slow, then stop. The proper display of submission, everything halted when addressed. "From the City Placement Agency." "Yes, my lord." A beat of silence. She was aware of him looking at her in the thorough, assessing way that alphas did, cataloging scent and posture and the minute signals of pack status that wolves read like text. She kept everything carefully neutral. Suppressing her natural scent took concentration, a low, constant effort like holding a yoga pose, but she'd been doing it for years. She was good at it. What she was less prepared for was the way he crouched down. Not looming, not dominant posturing. He simply folded himself down to her level, a fluid, almost casual movement, so that when she instinctively glanced up, startled, she found his face level with hers. She registered this the way she registered exits and guards and distances, arresting. Not beautiful exactly, though the bones of his face were precise and well-made. Arresting was the right word, the kind of face that stopped forward motion. His eyes were the deep amber of autumn oak leaves. They were also, at this range, doing something that eyes weren't supposed to do in a first 30-second interaction with a house servant. They were actually looking at her. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lyra," she said. She hadn't planned to give her real first name, but something about being directly looked at by someone who was actually looking had disrupted her usual fluency with fiction. "Lyra," he repeated, not an echo, a consideration, like he was trying out the weight of it. "I'm Selim." She blinked. "I know, my lord." "Selim is fine." He tilted his head slightly, and something shifted in his expression, a flicker of something she couldn't categorize, there and gone. "How long have you been on your knees?" The question was so unexpected that she answered honestly, "About 40 minutes. "The baseboards don't need," he glanced at the baseboard, paused. "Actually, they probably did need that. Fenwick's housekeeping is ambitious in theory." It was such a dry, sidelong observation that Lyra almost smiled. She caught it, converted it into a slightly less expressive version of itself. He stood. She returned her eyes to the baseboard. "Breakfast is in the main hall at 7, he said, "staff included." "Thank you, my lord." Another pause, then Selim. She didn't answer. He walked on. Lyra stared at the baseboard for a long moment after his footsteps faded, then pressed 2 fingers against her own pulse point. A habit when she needed to recalibrate. Her heart rate was elevated. That was a problem. Chapter 3: The Rules of the Game. By the end of the first week, Lyra had mapped 80% of the estate. She did it the way she did everything, incrementally, invisibly, making use of every legitimate reason to be in a corridor or a room. She carried cleaning supplies into hallways she needed to see. She got deliberately lost on her way to the laundry and corrected herself after a careful look around. She listened at keyholes the way she'd been taught, barely a breath, body angled so the listener's shadow didn't interrupt the gap of light. The North Tower was locked by 3 mechanisms: a standard key lock, a biometric panel, and something older, a ward she suspected laid in the foundation stones. The ward she'd have to deal with separately. The other 2 were solvable. She was working on it. What she was also, involuntarily, working on was the alpha. Selim Asheville was not what she'd expected. She'd built a picture from documents and reports: efficient, reserved, fair-handed, occasionally ruthless, the way all alphas became ruthless when pack law required it. A man of function and hierarchy, comfortable in his power, unlikely to look too closely at the furniture. The reality was more complicated. He looked too closely at everything. He walked his estate the way a careful mind walked a problem, attentively, revisiting, noticing what had changed. He knew the names of all his staff. He ate with them on Fridays, which was apparently a long-standing tradition his father had established, and he'd maintained with the matter-of-fact consistency of someone who didn't need to be seen being kind to make the kindness real. He was also, she was increasingly aware, watching her. Not aggressively, not suspiciously, at least not in any way she could confirm, but there was a quality to his attention that she couldn't quite dismiss. A second glance where most dominant wolves would have looked through her entirely. A momentary pause when she moved through a room. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself she was constructing significance from proximity. She told herself a lot of things with decreasing conviction. The thing she couldn't construct away was the night of the pack dinner. Chapter 4: Crack in the Mask. The pack gathered for a formal dinner on the second Friday of each month, and staff were expected to serve. Lyra moved through the dining hall with trays and a carefully maintained expression of pleasant blankness, tracking conversations in her peripheral and cataloging names against faces against the pack hierarchy she'd memorized. She was reaching across the table to refill a water glass when the wolf on her left, a beta named Torrance, mid-rank, the kind of man who had opinions about where the furniture should stand, put his hand on her wrist. Not hard, just proprietorial, a reminder, wordless, of what she was supposed to be. Lyra went still. She had a training reflex, a very fast, very efficient response to unwanted physical contact that would have had Torrance on the floor in approximately 1.5 seconds. She did not use it. She breathed. She kept her scent neutral and her body compliant, and waited for him to let go. Across the table, she heard the conversation pause. She looked up, couldn't help it, and found Selim's eyes on her wrist specifically, on Torrance's hand. His expression hadn't changed, not visibly, but something in the air of the room had, in that specific way that only dominant wolves could alter atmospheric pressure, and Torrance's hand lifted from her wrist a half-second later, as though the thought of keeping it there had simply evaporated. Torrance turned back to his dinner. The conversation resumed. No one mentioned it. Lyra set down the water pitcher and walked back toward the kitchen, and in the privacy of the hallway, she allowed herself exactly 3 seconds to stand completely still with her eyes closed. Then she picked up another tray and went back in. Later, much later, after the dinner had cleared and the kitchen staff had dispersed, and the estate had settled into its nighttime quiet, she was collecting the last of the serving items from the side table when she realized she was not alone in the dining hall. Selim was standing at the window at the far end of the room, looking out at the grounds. He'd shed his jacket. His back was to her. "You didn't react," he said without turning around. Lyra set down what she was holding, slowly. "My lord." "Earlier." With Torrance, he still didn't turn. Most Omegas would have flinched. "You went still." She manufactured a small, self-deprecating sound. "I've learned not to flinch." "There's a difference," he said, between learning not to flinch and having a trained response. Now he turned, and the low lamp from the sideboard caught his face from one side, leaving the other in shadow. You went still the way people go still when they're deciding not to do something, not when they're afraid. Lyra said nothing. The silence stretched between them like a test. I'm not going to report you to Fenwick, he said. I'm trying to understand who is actually in my house. It was such a direct statement that she almost laughed. She didn't. I'm the house servant assigned to the East Wing, my lord. Selim. Selim, she repeated, because he'd said it with enough quiet insistence that not repeating it would have been a different kind of tell. He studied her for a moment. She let him, keeping everything calm and surface level and unrevealing, and tried very hard not to notice that in the lamplight his eyes were less amber and more gold, and that the quality of his attention felt like being the only thing in a room that mattered. "Good night, Lyra," he said finally. "Good night," she said, and gathered the last of the serving items and left. She did not sleep well. Part 2, The Wolf Beneath. Chapter 5, Escalation. By the third week, the game had changed. Lyra wasn't sure when exactly it had shifted. It wasn't a single moment, but an accumulation, a slow and inexorable tipping of the balance, like water finding the lowest point in a landscape. But she became aware, one morning, that she was no longer simply moving through the estate gathering information. She was also watching him. She told herself it was strategic. She told herself she needed to understand his patterns, his blind spots, the moments when his attention was elsewhere. This was all true. It was also not the complete truth. The complete truth was that Selim Asheville was, among everything else he was, deeply interesting, and Lyra had been starved for interesting for a long time. She watched him run the morning circuit of the grounds, the efficient economy of his movement. She watched him manage disputes between pack members with a kind of patient precision, listening more than speaking, asking the question that rearranged the problem. She watched him sit with an injured packmate for 2 hours one afternoon, not saying much, just present, which was apparently what was needed. She watched him stand in front of the window of the East Wing library, her wing, late one evening, reading. The window gave out onto the kitchen gardens. She was below, ostensibly tending to a broken planter box, actually just. There was no good word for what she was actually doing. He looked up at some point and she looked away, and neither of them acknowledged it. The next morning he left a book on the side table in the East Corridor, where she always started her day. A history of the old pack territories pre-war, no note. He didn't look at her when she passed him in the hall. She read the book in 3 nights and left it back on the side table. The morning after that, there was a different book, a collected survey of cartography through the centuries, with particular attention to the northern territories. She felt the cartographer's star on her wrist like a brand. Chapter 6, The North Tower. She went for the tower on a night when the moon was 3 days from full, and the estate was distracted by a visiting delegation from a southern pack. She'd spent a week on the biometric lock. The ward in the foundation stones had taken longer, 2 evenings cross-referencing the resonance patterns she'd mapped against the old Thane archives she'd memorized before she left the city. The key had been the simplest part, a wax impression from a hook in Fenwick's office, a casted copy, a night's patience. She moved through the estate in the late dark, 3 in the morning, when even the night staff were at their lowest ebb. Down the servants' passage, through the kitchen garden door, around the outer wall of the East Wing, to where the North Tower rose from the estate's oldest stone. She was at the tower door, key in the lock, when she heard him. "I wondered when you'd come here." She did not run. Running was an admission. She turned slowly and found Selim leaning against the outer wall 10 feet behind her, arms crossed, dressed for the cold. He wasn't looking at her with suspicion or alarm. He was looking at her with something that might have been relief. "How long have you known?" she asked. She didn't see a point in the soft voice anymore. That you weren't what you said you were, since the second day. He pushed off the wall and came toward her, not fast, giving her time to see every step. The scent suppression is good, very good, but it's not perfect, and I've been trained to notice the absence of a scent as much as its presence. He stopped 5 feet away. An omega would have a scent even without a designation marker. You have nothing. You're a blank, and blank things don't occur in nature. Lyra felt something loosen in her chest, some long-held tension she'd been carrying so long she'd stopped noticing its weight. Then, why didn't you? Remove you, a slight shift in his expression. I wanted to know why you were here. You could have asked. Would you have answered? She considered this. No. I know. He looked at the tower door, then back at her. What's in there? She turned the key in the lock. It clicked. She said, the reason my mother is dead. Chapter 7. What was hidden? The North Tower was a library. Not the comfortable, inhabited library of the East Wing, with its worn chairs and reading lamps. This was older stone shelves, temperature-controlled, the quality of preserved darkness. The air smelled of must and something metallic, something that raised the hair on the back of Lyra's neck. She knew that smell. She'd smelled it once before, when she was 6 years old and her mother had crouched in front of her in a cold kitchen and pressed a cartographer's compass into her hand and said, "The maps are the proof, Lyra. The maps are everything." She moved past the shelves of packed-away documents and older scrolls to the back of the room, where the metal smell was strongest, where the warded safe stood in the far wall. She pressed her palm against it, felt the ward test her and recognized something in her blood, the old lineage markers that no forged ID chip could replicate, and heard the tumbler's release. Inside, 3 flat map cases, each sealed and wrapped, and a single leather journal. She stood very still, her hand on the journal. "That's my father's seal," Selim said from behind her. She turned. He was standing at the threshold, not having entered. Something in his face was carefully controlled. "Your father," she said, "made an agreement with the Thane Alpha 17 years ago. A treaty, territorial boundaries, resource sharing, mutual defense." She held up the journal. He signed it. Then when it became inconvenient, he contracted the destruction of the Thane pack rather than honor it. The maps in those cases show the boundary lines that would have made the Northern Territory a shared holding instead of an Asheville possession. She set the journal down. "My pack died for a land deal." The silence in the tower was absolute. Selim's jaw was tight. "I didn't know." "I know you didn't." She'd spent enough time watching him to be certain of that, at least. "You were 12 when it happened, and your father was very careful." "The pack that killed," he stopped, started again. "The Eastern faction in the Territory Wars. We were told they were an independent rogue unit." "Your father hired them." Another silence. Then, "Show me." Chapter 8. The Reckoning. They spent 3 hours in the tower. It wasn't the conversation Lyra had planned. She hadn't planned a conversation at all, had planned to retrieve the maps and be across the border by dawn. But Selim looked at every document with the steady, comprehensive attention he gave to everything, and asked questions that were the right questions, and didn't try to defend what couldn't be defended. And somewhere in the second hour she stopped being surprised by him and started being simply, plainly grateful. "What do you want?" he asked when they'd reached the end of it. She looked at him across the map table. He was rumpled now, tie gone somewhere around hour 1, sleeves pushed up, the controlled alpha face replaced by something more unguarded, more human, more real. "Acknowledgement," she said. "The treaty recognized, the territorial lines redrawn, the Thane name restored." "You're the last Thane." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "You'd be restoring it for a population of 1. My mother's people are still in the territory. They scattered, went to ground, changed names. They've been waiting." She looked at the maps. "I've been finding them for 3 years. There are more of us than the Asheville records account for. Something moved in his face. That's why you needed the maps, proof of the treaty, so the other packs would recognize the claim. And so I'd have something to show them. The people I've been finding, they need to know it wasn't for nothing, that there's something to come back to. He stood there for a long moment looking at her, and she let him look fully, for the first time, without the downcast eyes and the suppressed scent, and the 23 years of practiced smallness. She stood up straight, she let him see her. "Lyra Thane," he said, testing it. "Yes. You plan to just take these and disappear." "That was the plan. And now..." She looked at the window, where the sky was beginning its first hesitant lightening toward gray. She thought about the 6 weeks she'd spent in this estate, and the books left on hallway tables, and 3 hours in a tower at 4 in the morning with a man who'd looked at the worst thing his family had done and chosen to keep looking. "I don't know," she said honestly. He nodded slowly, like this was a reasonable answer. Then he said, "Stay. We can do this properly, have the documents formally witnessed, summon the Pack Council, make the recognition official. It'll take time. But it will hold. Asheville recognizing the Thane claim publicly would cost you territory. The treaty was signed by an Asheville Alpha. We should honor it." The muscle in his jaw moved. "We should have honored it 17 years ago." She studied him. He didn't look away. They were very close in the narrow tower room, and the maps between them and the coming dawn, and the weight of all that had been done and not done. "You'd have to acknowledge what your father did," she said. "I know. Your Pack Council won't like it. I know that too." She pressed her thumb against the cartographer's star on her wrist. Old habit, new meaning. Why? He met her eyes, and there was something in his face that was both complicated and very simple at once. "Because it's right," he said. "And because I'm not my father." Part 3, Rising. Chapter 9, The Wolf Wakes. She didn't leave. She moved out of the servant's closet. That happened on its own. A quiet and practical rearrangement that Fenwick absorbed with the expression of a man choosing his battles. And into a set of rooms in the east wing that had better light and a window that looked out on the grounds rather than the kitchen garden. She did not pretend to be an Omega anymore. This turned out to have consequences. The first was that her actual scent returned, unsuppressed, and filled the east wing with something that sent half the pack into a 3-day confusion, as their instincts tried to process what their social hierarchy was telling them was impossible. The other half reacted with open unease, because an unmated alpha-adjacent dominant female in a pack's territory without an established status was an anomaly the pack sense didn't know what to do with. Selim handled it with the same quality of unhurried firmness he brought to everything. He called a pack meeting, laid out the situation in plain language, and waited with patient certainty for the questions to run out. The questions took a while. Lyra stood beside him and didn't try to make herself smaller. It was strange, after so many years, standing full height felt almost like vertigo, like she had to relearn the balance of her own body. Torrance, the beta from the dinner, was the most vocal. He had a lot to say about precedent and pack law and the impropriety of harboring a foreign bloodline wolf under false pretenses. He didn't look at Lyra while he said it. Lyra looked at him. "The false pretenses were mine," she said calmly, into a brief pause. "I came here under a fabricated identity. That's on me. The question you might want to actually be asking is why a Thane heir felt the need to enter this estate in disguise to retrieve documents that legally belonged to her family." The room was quiet. "Because," she continued in the same measured tone, "the honest answer to that question is a lot more complicated for this pack than my identity is." She felt Selim, slightly to her left, and the quality of his stillness that she'd learned meant he was restraining the impulse to smile. The meeting lasted 2 more hours. By the end of it, the situation was not resolved. It was too complex for a single meeting to resolve, but the parameters had shifted. The pack sense, that collective animal intelligence that ran beneath the social structure of any wolf community, had registered something it understood even if the human social layer was still catching up. There was a Thane in Asheville territory. The Thane was standing up straight. The old blood remembered. Chapter 10, His Wolf. The change had been building for weeks. Lyra knew enough about werewolf physiology to recognize the signs, the tension that ran through Selim in the days after the tower, the particular quality of restraint that had settled around him like a second skin. She hadn't fully understood what it meant. She understood it on the night of the full moon, when she was in the East Wing library and heard something in the corridor that wasn't quite a sound and wasn't quite a feeling, but was entirely impossible to ignore. She found him in the training hall. It was a large space, stone floor, high ceiling, the equipment of combat practice racked along the walls. He was in the center of the room, and he was not quite himself, or rather he was more than himself, in the way that the full moon brought out, his wolf close to the surface. The careful control he maintained in his human form stretched very thin. He was facing away from her. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands were slightly wrong, the extended reach of dominant wolf energy that filled the room like pressure. "You should go," he said. His voice was rougher than usual. "The moon is full and I haven't," a pause, a breath. "I haven't been maintaining the separation properly for a few weeks." Lyra stepped into the room. She knew what unseparated meant. She understood werewolf physiology, the way extreme emotional states, stress, grief, sustained suppression of instinct, could begin to dissolve the boundary between human and wolf self. The way the wolf pushed up, increasingly present, increasingly reactive, until it either broke through or was addressed. She also understood, though she was less certain about the implications, that the wolf pushed up hardest in the presence of its mate. She stood in the middle of the training hall and thought about 6 weeks of books left on side tables, and a man crouching down to speak to her at her own level, and 3 hours in a tower that had felt, against all expectation, like the first honest thing she'd done in years. "I'm not afraid of your wolf," she said. He turned. He was golden in the training hall's amber light, his eyes fully shifted to that deep, brilliant amber, the human layer thin as tissue paper. He was also, she registered this, looking at her with the totality of attention she associated with him at his most present and most dangerous, except that dangerous had shifted into something else, something that hit her like the drop before understanding. She had been careful for 23 years. She had been so very, very careful. She had planned and prepared and maintained margins and kept herself separate from anything that could compromise the mission. She had not planned for him. "Lyra," he said, one word low like a question and a statement at once. "I know," she said, because she did. The wolf knew what her human mind had been arguing with for weeks, and the wolf, she thought, was right. She crossed the distance between them and put her hand against his face, feeling the slight fever heat of a wolf close to shifting, and said, "Easy." He turned his face into her palm like she'd offered him something he'd been a long time without. She felt her own control slip, not the trained control, the performed smallness, but something older, the suppression of her own dominant nature, the careful management of what she was, and for the first time in 23 years she let it go. Her scent filled the room, full and unmodulated in exactly what it was. Not Omega, not servant, not the ghost of a dead pack's last daughter. Alpha old blood. The resonance of the Thane line, which had been dominant since before the territory wars, since before the northern packs had boundaries, since the first wolves had run the ice forest and counted stars. Selim's eyes closed for a moment. When they opened, the amber had steadied. "There you are," he said very quietly. She laughed, small and startled, and it turned out she'd needed to do that for a long time too. "Here I am," she said. Chapter 11. Reckoning and Recognition. The formal recognition took 3 months. Lyra had expected it to be brutal. She'd planned for brutal, had contingencies for the pack council blocking the proceeding, for neighboring packs contesting the claim, for the kind of political ugliness that typically attended the overturning of established territorial fact. It was not easy. She hadn't expected easy. But she'd underestimated several things. The weight that Selim carried in the Northern Territories, the willingness of the Pack Council, once presented with the documented evidence of the treaty and the circumstances of the Thane Pack's destruction, to choose honesty over convenience, and the particular, quiet tenacity of the people she'd been finding for 3 years, scattered across the Northern Territories in small communities, who had been waiting for exactly this. They came when she called. Not many. The Thane Pack had never been large, but they came with their names and their stories and their memories of the territory that had been theirs, and they stood in the Asheville Great Hall on the day of the formal acknowledgement and did not try to make themselves small. She stood in front of the Pack Council, in the hall where she'd stood 6 weeks earlier with a collar around her throat, and she stood up straight, and she said her real name. Lyra Voss Thane, heir to the Thane Alpha line, surviving descendant of the Northern Thane Pack, petitioner for the recognition and reinstatement of the Treaty of the Northern Territories, signed and witnessed in the 42nd year of the Pack reckoning. The council acknowledged. The treaty was read into the Pack record. The boundary lines were redrawn on maps that would be sent to every registered pack in the Northern Territories within the week. Afterward, in the East Wing Library, Selim handed her a cup of tea and sat across from her in the worn armchair he'd apparently been claiming as his own for years and said, "How do you feel?" She thought about it honestly. "Like I've been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and I've just put it down." What happens now? The Thane settlement in the northeast corner of the territory, there are 19 families who have agreed to resettle. We'll need to build, establish the pack infrastructure. It'll take years. He nodded. "You'll need support. I'm capable of." "I know you are." He looked at her with that particular quality of directness she'd stopped trying to deflect. "I didn't say you weren't capable. I said you'd need support. Those aren't the same thing." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the library window, the grounds were bare-branched and silver with late autumn, and the kitchen garden was put to bed for the winter, and everything was exactly where she'd left it and completely different. The Asheville Alpha and the Thane Alpha, cooperating on a settlement project, she said, is going to raise questions. Let it raise them. Selim. Lyra, he said her name the way he'd said it in the tower the first time she'd stopped hiding it. Careful, like something worth keeping. My pack's relationship with your pack begins now, not 17 years ago. I'd like it to begin honestly. She looked at him for a long moment. She was good at reading people, she'd had to be, for survival, and what she read in him was not convenient attraction or political calculation, but something that had been building since a morning in a hallway when he'd crouched down to her level and introduced himself with his first name. Something true, something patient, something that had been waiting for her to stop running long enough to see it. Honestly, she repeated. Yes. She took a long breath, let it out, all right. Epilogue 1 year later. The Northeast settlement had 42 residents by the spring. Lyra stood on the rise above the new construction, 3 completed buildings, 5 more framed and rising, the grid of a small community taking shape in the valley below, and felt something she didn't have a word for. Not happiness exactly, though she was happy. Not peace, though there was peace in it. Something more like recognition, like finally arriving at the place she'd been navigating toward since she was 6 years old and her mother had pressed a compass into her hand. She heard him coming. She'd stopped suppressing her wolf sense months ago, and it had come back fully, sharpened by years of careful maintenance even when she wasn't supposed to have it. Selim stopped beside her on the rise. 42, she said. I heard 63 are planning to come by summer, he said. She smiled. It was a full smile, nothing held back. Fenwick is going to need more clipboard pages. Fenwick has been in the city for 2 months. He sent 17 memos about the cleanliness of the East Wing in his absence. I know, I read them. Selim looked at the valley below, where her people, her pack, her word for them still felt new and necessary, were building something from what had been almost nothing. Then he looked at her, in the way he'd looked at her from the beginning, fully, without partition, like she was something worth attending to. I have a meeting with the Northern Council in 2 weeks, he said. The agenda includes a proposal for a formal alliance structure between Asheville and Thane, permanent, binding. I've read the draft. She'd been part of writing it. It's good. There's a provision in the draft, he paused. It goes beyond a territorial alliance. She turned to look at him. The morning light was full on his face, and his eyes were the amber gold she'd stopped pretending she didn't notice, and he was being careful, being deliberate, leaving her every space to say no. I know, she said. I wrote that provision. A beat. Then the quality of his expression shifted, something warm and certain rising through the surface of his careful control. Did you? He said. Someone had to. She looked back at the valley, at the rising buildings, at the sign someone had put up yesterday above the settlement gate, simple, hand-lettered Thane's Rest, and felt the compass in her chest, the one she'd carried since she was 6 years old, stop pointing at the horizon. Point here. Point now. Yes, she said before he could ask. Whatever you were going to say, yes. She heard him breathe. Then he took her hand, and the morning was clear and cold and full of what they'd built and what was coming. And Lyra Voss Thane, Alpha Heir, cartographer of lost territories, returned from the long exile, stood on the hill above her settlement and let herself, at last, be exactly where she was.